Hello everyone and welcome back to oral presentations for Anthropology of Southeast Asia. Today I will be talking to you about Orang Seletar, which is one of the disappearing languages from the Strait of Johor, which separates peninsular Malaysia from Singapore. The Orang Seletar language is spoken by the Orang Seletar people, who are part of a larger categorization known as the Orang Asli, which in Malay means original people, Orang meaning people, Asli meaning original. The Orang Asli in peninsular Malaysia are broadly classified under three main groups by the Malaysian Department of Orang Asli's Progress, also known as JOCOA. So the three categories are the Negritos in the north, the Senoi in the center, and the Proto-Malays or the Aboriginal Malays in the south. The Orang Seletar are part of this latter category, which is the Aboriginal Malays, who migrated to the peninsula and archipelago between 2500 and 1500 BC. The name Seletar comes from an island known as Pulau Seletar in the Strait of Johor off of the northern coast of Singapore, which currently resides within Singaporean borders. The Seletar people used to live on this island and around and navigate very easily up until the 1980s, but they were relocated because of impending development. And this is part of an ongoing struggle for their identity and their language, which we will address in future slides. But as mentioned, the speakers of the language currently live along the Strait of Johor, which divides peninsular Malaysia from Singapore. And they can be found on both sides of the borders, but are under Malaysian governance. The current number of speakers ranges between 1,200 and 1,500, and the language has been studied very little, and it's spoken by a small number of people whose lifestyle is currently in danger. There is ongoing work to study and record the language, and there's also a debate as to whether the language should be considered independent or whether it's a dialect of Malay. As you can see here, it's part of the Austronesian language group, and it is closest to Malay. It does not have a writing system, and that also makes it very vulnerable, and it is considered severely endangered by the UNESCO Atlas of World Languages. So as I mentioned previously, there is not a lot of research done on Orang Seletar language structure and grammar per se. A lot of the research has focused primarily on the people and their lifestyle, but we'll just work with what we have. So in 1972, a French ethnologist by the name of Christian Pellerat, who was interested in the people of Indonesia and Malaysia, first studied the language, and he reached the following conclusions regarding its linguistic makeup. He stated that it consisted of 85% Malay words, 5% words that were present in Malay but had different meanings in Orang Seletar, and then about 10% of words with no Malay analog, but that were similar to other words that were found in languages of Kalimantan Island, for example. So based on this data, he reached the conclusion that it was more likely that Orang Seletar was a dialect of Malay rather than a language in its own right. So because research has been so limited and information is not readily available on this language per se, I will present some of the basic features of Malay first, and then I will share some differentiation points that Orang Seletar exhibits in light of more recent studies in the next slide. So some of the features of Malay. First of all, it's not considered a tonal language. A tonal language is one where the pitch will change the meaning of a word even if the pronunciation is the same. So for example, Thai, Vietnamese, or Chinese are considered tonal languages, but Malay is not. As we know, based on the history of this area, Malay is a language that emerged out of trade and religious influence over the last 2 millennia. So it's vocabulary is made up of words that are borrowed from Arabic and Sanskrit and Tamil, Persian, Portuguese, Dutch, and even some Chinese languages. It is considered an agglutinative language, and what agglutination is, it's a linguistic process where complex words are formed by stringing together morphemes without changing them in spelling or phonetics. So there are three processes through which new words are created. The first one is called affixation, and that's when an affix is attached to a root word. That's something that goes at the end of the word as opposed to a prefix, which would go at the beginning of the word. The second process is composition, where we basically put together multiple words to create a compound word. And then reduplication, which means repetition of words or a portion of words. The Malay word order is subject, verb, object, like in English. And then there are no plurals, no grammatical gender or verb conjugation for person, number, or tense, all of which is instead expressed with adverbs or tense indicators. So here we have an example of a tense indicator. So we have saya makan, which means I eat or I'm currently eating. And then we have saya makan sudah, which means I eat already or I ate. It already happened, past tense. Now an example of reduplication would be for the plural of chickens. So we have ayam dia, which translates as his chickens. And the singular for chicken is ayam, the plural being ayam. And then Malay also has a complex system of verb affixes to render nuances of meaning and to denote voice or intentional or accidental moods. In 2015, research on the Orang Seletar language has been picked up by two individuals at Brigham Young University in Utah, and their names are Kevin Blissett and Dirk Elzinga. They state in their findings that the research is ongoing and still in its early stages. But basically what they did was collect data through face-to-face interviews with native speakers in their homes throughout Malaysia. And they collected target words from a Swadesh list, which is basically like a classic compilation of basic concepts for the purposes of historical comparative linguistics. So it's just a list of the most common words in a particular language. So they guided the interviewees through the process of translating the Swadesh list from Malay into their own languages. And then the responses were recorded on a digital audio recorder and transcribed using the International Phonetic Alphabet. Another aspect of the interviews was brief conversations about linguistic genealogies of the speakers in order to ascertain at what level and what generations the language is still spoken. Based on their research, they weren't really able to find anything incredibly conclusive as to whether it is a language in its own right or a dialect of Malay, and they address this directly. So their take is that based on vocabulary alone, it would appear to be a dialect of Malay, but there are certain features that could potentially make it its own language, such as the fact that it is not counter-intelligible with Malay and considered a separate language by the Orang Seletar. Also, some of the affixes that are essential to Malay do not appear in Orang Seletar language, such as the active MEN prefix, which we find in Malay. There's also another affix, which is the an, the an suffix, that also does not make an appearance in Orang Seletar. And then the negation of verbs is completely different. So one could argue that based on these features, it could be considered another language, but yet again, there's so little research being dedicated to this that the conversation is just sort of ongoing. So I've attached here also just some words from the Swadesh list that the researchers compiled. So you have first column the English word, in the second column the Malay word, and then the third column the Orang Seletar. So I've just identified a couple of the words that, to the best of my ability, are different from Malay in Orang Seletar. So we have hand, which would be Tangan in Malay. I honestly don't know how to pronounce it, but I've just identified some of the words here. So we have words like hand, husband, lake, man, mountain. So things that refer to individuals or the landscape and the geography. The speakers of Orang Seletar have lived in mangrove swamps and the coast of Johor and Singapore, and they are descended from the Austronesian migrants who came to the area during 2500 and 1500 BC, and the Austronesian migration that occurred during that time. Their livelihood consists primarily of fishing and crafts related to fishing, such as weaving and boat building. Currently, there are about between 1,200 and 1,500 speakers, and the language is spoken primarily by grandparent and parent generations, but less so in the first generations who speak primarily Malay, especially as they are becoming more educated and integrated into mainstream culture, which is Malay dominant. So historically, the Orang Seletar have lived nomadic and mobile lives, basically spending their entire life fishing in wooden boats known as dampau or sampan, and they technically don't own land, and as a result of that, they're among the poorest people in Malaysia currently. They have an interesting relationship to the state and various forms of government because historically they have been nomadic and lived sort of coastal lives, and they were a vital part of the trade economy that was happening, as early as the 7th century and going into the age of commerce. And they have been protected or recognized by the Sultanate, and have mostly had positive relationships, but nothing was ever documented, and because they didn't own land, they were very susceptible to relocation as development has happened historically. This was the case in the 1980s when they were forced to leave Seletar Island, which was off the coast of Singapore, and they were relocated in Malaysia, on the Malaysian side of the Strait of Johor, in 9 kampongs in relative proximity to the water, but not necessarily always close to the water. The government has attempted to integrate them into society through relocation on land first, conversion to Islam, practice of agriculture, and adopting modern-day jobs like factory work. But the Orang Seletar people are very much attached to their lifestyle. It's a core feature of their identity. Living by the water, being by the water, living off the water. So there's this conflict happening between sea living and land living, and it's really hard for them to adapt to modern day living. Historically, their kids have been primarily uneducated, because they would learn to swim and fish as early as 3 years old and are renowned for being excellent swimmers and being able to hold their breath underwater for 10 minutes, can catch fish with their bare hands, which is pretty impressive. But once adults started working more demanding modern-day jobs, the children started going to school, and because they would have to be looked after by members of the community. Since they live in very poor communities and occasionally travel by boat to get places, it's sometimes hard for them to get to school when the tide is low and the boats can't cross. And as far as religion is concerned, the Orang Seletar practice animism, and because they find Islam to be fairly restrictive, even though some have converted to Islam and Christianity. And they tend to identify more with Chinese cultural practices such as eating pork and drinking friendly because they're more flexible. I think some of the biggest challenges that the Orang Seletar are faced with today in terms of cultural preservation have to do with the environment, economics, and culture and religion, cultural and religious pressure to assimilate. So, as far as the environment is concerned and economically, once they did eventually gain access to land and resources, the land that they were given is unfortunately located in an area that is rampantly developing, is incredibly polluted, and as a result of all this industrialization, the natural habitat that they have inherited has been gradually declining to the point where they are no longer able to fish like they used to and sustain themselves from local crafts, from the forest and the wood that they were able to harvest previously. So a lot of this economic pressure has led some to attempt to integrate into Malay society, but that's really not preferable. And because in order for them to assimilate to Malay society, they would have to convert to Islam, which once again is not preferable because that would lead to loss of language and cultural identity. So based on everything that we've learned so far, it seems pretty obvious that loss of cultural diversity is impending and potentially inevitable for the Orang Seletar community unless action is taken. The government hasn't been particularly helpful in this regard in terms of creating cultural diversity programs. They've been helpful in land disputes, but not much further. So it seems that the best way for the Orang Seletar to preserve their way of living is by becoming economically self-sufficient, which they've accomplished through entrepreneurship by opening their own seafood restaurants which cater to Chinese and Singaporean demographic. They've also created the Seletar Tourism and Cultural Society, which aims to preserve various aspects of their traditional lifestyle. They perform dances and various other kinds of performances as a way of helping their community generate supplementary income, as well as spreading awareness about the Orang Seletar lifestyle and community at large. I personally think it is incredibly important to maintain as rich of a linguistic heritage as possible. I am personally bilingual myself, and English is not my first language, though it has become the dominant language in my life, and I often find that that's a shame because it comes at the expense of me being able to speak my mother tongue fluently. But I think so much of identity for humans historically has to do with shared language, kinship, locality, storytelling. I think we need to feel anchored and rooted in some place or some sort of narrative or something that connects us so that we remember that we are connected. And I think it's going to become increasingly more difficult for people to find some sort of sense of purpose or comfort and rootedness in this world if they don't know the journey that came before in order for them to understand where they are now and where they will go in the future. And another thing to consider, if we think of Southeast Asia and just the richness that it has in terms of flora and fauna and how that's reflected linguistically, once the languages disappear before they're documented, and the environment disappears before everything is documented, and its speakers no longer can access that information, then it seems like such a shame and such a waste, and a loss of something that we will no longer be able to access. I think that would be incredibly sad.